This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 849 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. The fantasy football playoffs are here, and the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon, it's still going strong. Join the Patreon, and you can get rest of season rankings and tiers, weekly rankings and tiers, a data dump that includes fantasy football playoff strength of schedule, an awesome Discord community, and more. This is an all-year thing for me. I'm not going to stop when the fantasy season stops. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, but we're getting right into prospect season and more dynasty-focused content right when the season ends. So check it all out by heading to lateround.com. Dawson Knox returned to action in Week 14. He likely didn't play the kind of snaps he's going to play rest of season, and there were reports that he would be eased back in. But with that being said, I think it was a good week overall for Dalton Kincaid. He actually had his best route participation since Week 10, and he still had a 22% target share. The bigger problem was that according to Fantasy Life's utilization report, his average depth of target was the lowest that it's been in weeks, but I'd expect something like that to fluctuate. Even though Kincaid didn't perform, I'm not overly concerned about his rest of season outlook. Zay Flowers has now played 3 full games without Mark Andrews this season. Andrews missed Week 1, Week 12, and then Week 14. In those games, Flowers scored 17.7, 23.2, and 20 PPR points. His target shares in those games, 48%, 27%, and 25%. His route participation over his last 2 has been 100%. He's run a route on all of Baltimore's dropbacks. And his usage isn't like what we saw back in Week 1. If you remember during his big breakout to start the year, Flowers had an average depth of target of just 2.6 yards in that game. Over his last 2, it's been 6 and 12 yards. He's in a very good spot for the fantasy playoffs. There was a rap sheet report before Week 14 stating that Austin Eckler's usage was going to change, that the Chargers were going to use their other running backs and have more of a rotation. And that kind of happened, but it also kind of didn't happen. Eckler did see his running back rush share drop to 52.6% in that game. That was his lowest mark since Week 1. But his route participation was over 70%. That gave him his second highest participation of the season. And he played 72% of their snaps. That was more than the majority of his games this year. So the Chargers may have tried to do more to get their other backs involved, but game script and Eckler's pass catching ability, it kept him on the field. All Chargers players obviously get a downgrade with Justin Herbert now out, but that should also mean more negative game scripts, and that'll at least mean more Austin Eckler more than likely. Evan Ingram went off against the Browns this past week, and I wasn't ready for it at all. Ingram posted an 11-catch, 95-yard, 2-touchdown line against Cleveland. He scored 32.5 PPR points. That's impressive enough. But it's even more impressive when you consider Ingram became just the second tight end this season to score more than 8 PPR points against Cleveland. They've been absolutely dominant against tight ends this year. Ingram's target share, it's up a little bit without Christian Kirk. It was about 22.4% per game to start the season, but then across his last 2 games, it's been closer to 24%. So there's a little bit of a bump. The real difference, though, is that his touchdown regression is hit. He's now scored 3 times over his last 2. He has a tough tight end schedule in the fantasy playoffs, but it probably doesn't matter much for him. He's locked in right now. After Jaylen Warren's first game without Matt Canada, I thought people were being a little bit over the top about his usage. He scored just 7 PPR points, but his usage, it was basically the same as what it's been throughout the season. So why not buy into him a little bit, given the overall sentiment? Well, things haven't really gotten better without Canada. Warren has now scored no more than 8 PPR points in his 3 games without Matt Canada as offensive coordinator. His running back rush share, it's actually shrinking. During his 4 games before the Canada firing, his running back rush share was 43%. Per game. Over his last 2, that's been closer to 36%. I do think better days are ahead versus what we've been seeing, but it doesn't look like the Steelers are going to make a dramatic change with Jaylen Warren versus Najee Harris. I don't know if that was the expectation per se, but it was always a possibility without Matt Canada. Devon Achan's usage in Week 14 was pretty interesting. He only saw a quarter of Miami's running back rushes, but he hit a season-high 27% target share. According to Fantasy Life, Achane played 100% of the team's 2-minute snaps, and he was on the field for 67% of their long down and distance snaps. Those were both season highs, and they're a key reason that his target share was as high as it was. That's a good sign, though. Miami gets Dallas and Baltimore in the fantasy playoffs, and that's helpful to know that if this trend continues, Achane could still be a viable option in those tougher matchups. Because if he's the receiving back, if the Dolphins lose a lead, which is possible if they have a negative game script, he's going to be on the field. This week will likely be a little bit different, though, against the Jets. Just when we think that we know how the Ravens' backfield is going to project, things change. In Week 14, Justice Hill played 42% of Baltimore snaps. That was his highest mark since Week 9. He didn't carry the ball once, but he played a receiving role with a 29% route participation. When looking at their previous game versus the one that we just watched, Keaton Mitchell saw his snap share drop by 13 percentage points. His route participation fell from 38% to 16%. That's a pretty significant difference. He fortunately saw 60% of Baltimore's running back rushes in Week 14, but it does look like that there's still a cap ceiling to his receiving profile. Unless he breaks a big play, which is always possible. But that's something to keep in mind down the stretch. I don't hide from my misses in fantasy football. I'm going to get stuff wrong. I'm going to get stuff right. That's just how this goes. Calling Deebo Samuel more of a sell than a buy a couple of weeks ago, that was a huge miss on my end. Deebo's been the top wide receiver in fantasy football over the last 2 weeks. Even if he does regress, which I'm expecting to still happen to some degree, it was an L. I won't get everything right, and I definitely did not get that right. The 49ers offense was interesting this past week, though. Deebo saw a 33% target share, one of his highest of the season, and that came at a price for Christian McCaffrey. CMC finished Week 14 with just a 3.7% target share. His route participation, though, was on point. It was the exact same that has basically been all season long. That was the thesis as to why I expected Deebo to not maintain his Week 12 pace. Then Week 13 happened, where he was just Deebo Samuel. He had probably his best game of his season. He did a whole lot with very little. And then this past week, Week 14, he took a lot of the Christian McCaffrey looks. So hand me the L on that recommendation. But I'm still expecting the 49ers pass catchers to be somewhat of a roller coaster rest of season. Basically, it's a give and take thing. If there's one word to describe the Carolina Panthers passing attack, it's probably depressing. They've thrown 1 passing touchdown since Week 9. But they've now played 2 games without Frank Reich and that coaching staff, or at least a lot of that coaching staff. And in those 2 games, according to Fantasy Life, Bryce Young's average depth of target is significantly higher than it was before the firing. His ADOT has been 11.3 and 13.8 yards over his last 2. He never had an ADOT above 8 when Frank Reich was head coach, which is kind of crazy. Even though it hasn't really converted yet, that should at least give the passing attack a little bit more upside in fantasy football. The last trend this week is about my guy, Jayden Reed. Christian Watson has now missed 4 games this season, weeks 1 through 3, and then he was out this past week against the Giants. He didn't have huge snap shares here and there, but those were the games that he was out. In those contests, Jayden Reed has averaged a 23.3% target share per game rate. He scored over 14 PPR points per game, and 2 of those games, he's been around 20 PPR points. Now, outside of those games, his target share is almost 9 percentage points lower. His points per game output, almost 3 points lower. Reed has a legit opportunity down the stretch to help you win a fantasy title, as long as Christian Watson's sidelined. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.